A heroic, pure sapiens lineage, sharpened by climate and fate, after 300,000 years of slow evolution, suddenly rises up sometime around 50,000 years ago and explodes into the wider world, sweeping aside the archaic peoples of Eurasia and Africa like a tide. The modern human, the final model, the victorious species. In the popular imagination, it is not just a migration, it is a conquest. Yet some critics who resisted the replacement model once gave this story a name sharp enough to sting: the killer Africans. It was meant as provocation, a way of exposing the unspoken truth hidden inside scientific euphemisms like replacement. But the phrase endured because it captured what the simple version of out of Africa, or the Noah's Ark theory, as it was originally known, requires an almost total erasure of every human who was already living in Eurasia, in an ecological theatre where such clean exterminations are rare. Noah's Ark theory, in its total replacement form, is not just a migration story, it is an extinction story so unimaginable we hesitate to say it out loud. Because if modern humans truly surged out of sub-Saharan East Africa 50,000 years ago and replaced everyone already living across North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Asia and Australia, then the model quietly demands something monstrous: a near-total genetic erasure of every human population north of the Sahara, not a gradual blend, a continental wipeout. It means that whatever lineages had occupied the eastern Mediterranean rim, the Nile Corridor, Morocco, the Levantine caves, the Iranian plateau, and the vast steppe belts, people who had histories stretching back tens or hundreds of thousands of years, were reduced to biological ash, leaving only a thin residue of DNA as proof that anything was there at all. That is not dispersal. That is the greatest mass extinction of humans ever proposed, entire peoples disappearing so completely that their descendants become statistically invisible, their genomes scrubbed from the living world as if history itself had been sterilized. And here's the craziest part. If you accept that story, you are accepting a mass extinction scale event without a crime scene. A global replacement with no credible mechanism proportionate to the outcome. A purge so absolute it has to be disguised with a neutral word, replacement, just to make it socially pronounceable. Yet the deeper one looks into genetics, fossils, and the geography of Ice Age contact zones, the harder it becomes to believe in that clean fable. Not because Africa was not also important, but because Europe was not born from Africa in the way the myth suggests. Europe did not descend from a single triumphant African pulse arriving as a finished product. Europe was manufactured over a long span of time in a Eurasian hybrid crucible where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlapped, collided, merged, and remade each other again and again. If the old story is a spear thrust, the new one is metallurgy, heat, repetition, impurities, and forging. This framework has a name, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it: the Neanderthal phase of man. The claim is not that Europeans are Neanderthals, nor that modern humans are some archaic species rebranded. The claim is far more consequential. Europeans are the end product of a long Neanderthal sapiens hybrid population, an ancient overlap zone that predated the famous 50,000-year expansion. In this model, Cro-Magnons, including the famous skulls of Meladec and Oase, were not a pristine lineage entering Europe and sprinkling itself with a few Neanderthal genes. They were the advanced hybrids, the final export of a Near Eastern genetic furnace that started with the Skul, Kafze, Zutia, Tabun, Apidyma, and other fossils that you can see with your own eyes. The National Geographic narrative says Europe is mostly sapiens, with a thin, archaic aftertaste. The Neanderthal phase of man says something else entirely. Europe is Eurasian, shaped fundamentally by an early Neanderthal phase and prolonged interbreeding, so prolonged that calling Europeans recent Eurasians becomes at best a simplification and at worst a categorical mistake. However, even the Noah's Ark theory admits startling divergence times between African and Eurasian lineages, sometimes pushed back toward 170,000 years, with an into Arabia event 130,000 to 80,000 years ago, then a long bottleneck, before diverging into different Eurasian groups starting around 50,000 years, depending on the model. This is a 100,000-year difference between the fairy tale version and the scientific version of the theory. But nothing in the model says that there ever had to be a migration event rather than continuous evolution in the Near East. In maps, the Near East is drawn like a narrow passage connecting Africa to the rest of the world. It is the gateway. People pass through it, then vanish into Europe and Asia. The Neanderthal phase begins by rejecting that geometry. The Near East was not a temporary stop. It was a frontier continent, an ecological hinge between Mediterranean woodland and desert steppe, and between two human populations that both considered it home, sometimes at different times, sometimes at the same time, and sometimes in alternating pulses like competing tides. When you treat the Near East as a corridor, you treat Neanderthals as a European species and sapiens as an African one. But Ice Age geography does not respect those labels. The Near East was not Europe's border, it was Eurasia's core contact zone. Neanderthals were not strictly European. They were Eurasian in the fullest sense, ranging repeatedly into Southwest Asia. And sapiens were Near Eastern themselves, populations established in the Near East early enough that a simple expansion narrative becomes insufficient. Once you accept this, a difficult possibility emerges. Europe's ancestry may have formed in Eurasia long before Europe itself was populated by modern humans, not as a clean lineage, but as a layered interacting metapopulation, an interwoven system in which what we call sapiens and what we call Neanderthal are less like separate species and more like drifting clusters with permeable borders. In other words, the Near East did not merely transmit modern humans to Europe, it manufactured the kind of modern humans who could become Europeans. The Noah's Ark replacement story survives through a single concept, one recent interbreeding event. Modern humans expand. They meet Neanderthals. They interbreed once, perhaps twice, then march forward. That is why the general public is taught to think in percentages, 2%, 3%, small traces like dust. It makes the archaic DNA seem like a minor footnote, not a foundational chapter. But the moment you understand this as an overlap zone across tens of thousands of years, the one event collapses. If sapiens and Neanderthals repeatedly occupied the same landscapes, hunting the same herds, sheltering in the same caves, competing in the same climate swings, then interbreeding is not a rare accident. It becomes a baseline expectation, not constant in the sense of every generation, but constant in the only sense that matters. Recurring, persistent, inevitable. A frontier with two neighbouring populations does not produce one hybrid incident. It produces a hybrid history. In the Neanderthal phase, Europe's ancestors were forged through repeated pulses of contact. Neanderthal groups in the Near East contributed genes into sapiens-like populations. Sapiens groups contributed genes into Neanderthal populations. And the whole process produced an increasingly blended Near Eastern population that eventually expanded outward. The key point is structural. Europeans did not acquire a trivial amount of Neanderthal ancestry at a single moment in time. They inherited a genome that had been exposed repeatedly to Neanderthal introgression, then refined by selection and drift within Eurasian ecologies. The standard model treats hybridization like a side note. The Neanderthal phase treats it like the main story. There is no number in paleoanthropology more famous and more misleading than the idea that Europeans are about 2% Neanderthal. It is true in a narrow sense. If you compare modern genomes against a limited set of sequenced Neanderthal references and count detectable segments, you often obtain values in that range. But as a cultural idea, as the story people tell themselves about ancestry, it is catastrophically deceptive. First, recombination shatters archaic segments over time. If admixture is ancient and repeated, fragments become smaller, harder to detect, easier to misclassify, and more likely to blend into the statistical background. Second, selection removes deleterious archaic variants preferentially, meaning the surviving archaic segments are not random. They are the ones that either slipped through or helped. Lastly, reference bias is real. We compare modern humans to a few Neanderthal genomes, yet Neanderthals were not one population. There were many Neanderthals with regional structure across Eurasia. Some introgressed DNA could derive from Neanderthal groups we have never sequenced and would therefore not look Neanderthal in the simplistic way people imagine. But the most important issue is conceptual, not technical. Even if Europeans carried only a few % of Neanderthal segments today, the biological influence could still be profound because what matters is not sheer percentage, it is architecture. Regulatory regions, immune system tuning, metabolism, skin physiology, and developmental pathways can have outsized phenotypic impact relative to their raw genomic proportion. A small number of gene regulatory changes can reshape a body more than 1,000 neutral variants scattered randomly. In the Neanderthal phase, the claim is not that Europeans are mostly Neanderthal in raw DNA fraction. The claim is that Europeans carry a Neanderthal-shaped genome, in the sense that Eurasian selection pressures preserved and amplified archaic contributions that were useful in colder climates, turning introgression into an adaptive scaffolding. Neanderthal DNA is not paint on the walls of European ancestry. It is in the structural beams. And once you admit that Europe's ancestry contains a deep Near Eastern layer, the identity of Europeans changes. They do not look like a mere offshoot. They look like the outcome of a multi-layered West Eurasian history, with lighter pigmentation, blonde and red hair, and even freckling inherited from Neanderthals. Now we arrive at the most controversial claim of all. Cro-Magnons were advanced Neanderthal sapiens hybrids. Not in the simplistic sense that they were half Neanderthal, no, but in the more radical sense that Cro-Magnons were not a pure lineage entering Europe and displacing Neanderthals. They were the Near Eastern hybrid population finally expanding into Europe, bringing with it a genome already tuned by Eurasian contact and already carrying archaic adaptations, some inherited genetically, some inherited culturally. The very category Cro-Magnon becomes telling here. It has long functioned as a shorthand for the first modern Europeans, the clean origin point for the European story. But origins are never that simple. Under the Neanderthal phase, Cro-Magnons become the crystallization of a process that began much earlier and much farther east. A Near Eastern evolutionary engine that fused lineages, refined them, and exported the results. Why would a Near Eastern hybrid lineage succeed where Neanderthals failed? The answer is not that Neanderthals were inferior. The answer is that the Near Eastern system created something new, a hybrid population with a wider adaptive repertoire, ecologically flexible, cognitively sophisticated, culturally inventive, and genetically primed for Ice Age Eurasia through archaic assimilation. If Neanderthals were Eurasia's deep residents, then Cro-Magnons were something else, a population type, born at the boundary, sharpened by contact, and carrying the strengths of both. Cro-Magnons, in this model, are Eurasian survivors, the inheritors of a hybrid frontier that had been running for more than 100,000 years. One reason the Noah's Ark theory gained moral force is that it implied a clean, almost biblical narrative. Pure humans emerge in a Garden of Eden, then cleanse the world of archaic humans. But genetics has been dismantling the idea of purity on every continent. This matters because it breaks the psychological underpinning of replacement theory, the idea that there is a baseline Homo sapiens template and Eurasians are a modified version. In reality, everyone is modified, everyone has admixture, everyone has layers. If Africans absorbed archaic hominins in Africa and Eurasians absorbed Neanderthals, then the correct framing is not pure versus hybrid. It is hybrid systems versus hybrid systems, each forged in their own contact zones. In the Neanderthal phase, Europe becomes the end product of a Near Eastern assimilation history. Neither narrative permits moral caricature. The world is not pure, it never was. Neanderthal populations were never small and fragile. They look small because only small groups of Neanderthal interbred with modern humans. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The Noah's Ark theory requires something like a demographic annihilation. It demands that all human populations north of the Sahara, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic or archaic-adjacent lineages, be reduced to near zero genetic contribution except for faint traces. That is the replacement logic. It is why the phrase killer Africans had rhetorical traction. It forced people to hear what their models implied. But the Neanderthal phase proposes a different picture. Instead of a sharp recent cleansing, it proposes a long blending, in which European ancestry emerges not from extermination, but from assimilation and expansion of a mixed Near Eastern population. This model does not require mass extinction. It requires ecology, contact, migration, and repeated pulses of gene flow. It tells a story closer to how humans actually behave. Conflict and mixture, separation and fusion, competition and intermarriage, boundary zones that turn into cultures. It also explains an otherwise haunting feature of genetic narratives, the way the Near East keeps appearing not merely as a transit point, but as the ancestral core of later West Eurasian expansions. The Near East does not look like a door. It looks like a hearth. So what does Europe descend from, if not from a single band of hyper-competitive sapiens surging north? In the Neanderthal phase, Europe descends from a Neanderthal sapiens hybrid metapopulation built over immense time. This is why the Noah's Ark theory becomes not just inflammatory but inaccurate. Europeans are best described as Eurasians shaped by an ancient hybrid crucible, exported into Europe as the final product of a long frontier process. In this story, Cro-Magnons are not invaders. They are the heirs of interbreeding, selection, and cultural fluorescence at the edge of continents. They are the last chapter of the Neanderthal phase. There is a reason this reframing feels like heresy. It changes the emotional map of human origins. It denies Europe the comforting fiction of purity, yet it also denies it the condescending myth of derivation. It replaces the idea of a clean departure with something more real and more human, a long, messy, intimate frontier history. The original Neanderthals were not wiped away like wild animals. They were absorbed, partially, repeatedly, structurally, into the very people who would later build Europe's Ice Age societies. The Near East was not a corridor. It was the engine. Europeans are the descendants of a Neanderthal sapiens population of hybrids who had already been living, overlapping and evolving in Eurasia long before the famous late expansion. They are not a simple offshoot. They are a synthesis. And that is the most unsettling possibility of all, that what we call modern human is not a species victory. It is a hybrid victory, and Europe is its most vivid evidence. Thanks for watching.